Live, trance, and prosper. Hi, I'm Dr. Brian David Phillips, and today I'd like to talk to you a bit about the principle of charity in critical thinking or logic. Now, this kind of charity isn't the same as faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity. Not quite the same as that kind of thinking. Rather, in logic or critical thinking, the principle of charity is very similar to the idea of benefit of the doubt. Essentially, in philosophy and rhetoric, the principle of charity requires interpreting a speaker's statements to be rational, and in the case of an argument, considering the best, strongest possible interpretation of an opponent's rhetoric or their communication. In the narrow sense, the goal of this methodological principle is to avoid attributing irrationality, logical fallacies, or falsehoods to the statements made by others. When a coherent, rational interpretation of the statements is available. All right. Now, essentially, according to Simon Blackburn, this constrains an interpreter to maximize the truth of rationality in a subject's sayings. Neil Wilson gave the principle its name in the 1950s, and its main area of application, by his understanding, is determining the referent of a proper name. Now, actually, and just in a nutshell, consider the principle of charity as give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. All right, so if an opponent says something and your immediate reaction is, well, that's a stupid thing to say, is to argue. Your immediate reaction is to argue. You take that impulse to argue immediately, and you squelch that sucker. And you listen carefully to the argument. Now, sometimes people say things and they use words. Sometimes the words they use have particular meanings in certain contexts, but sometimes those words are kind of vague. For instance, years ago here in Taiwan, I'm pointing here, I live in Taiwan, have lived here for a couple and a half decades, but years ago we had a huge debate about legal prostitution. Now, when the foreign media got a hold of that, because it's a nice, juicy topic to get your headlines, legalizing prostitution, they used the word prostitution in ways that it wasn't being used in the local debate here. And so essentially, they were actually talking about completely different things. When the president at that time, or rather the mayor at that time, was discussing legalized prostitution, he was discussing a specific area, Snake Alley, where there were already working legal prostitutes. There's also illegal prostitutes. But years ago, the government had given licenses to certain women to work as prostitutes. Predominantly, they were essentially working as prostitutes as pretty much camp followers. The government licensed prostitutes so that soldiers who were away from home had an outlet for their sexual energy. All right, those were the legal prostitutes being discussed. And a debate came up as they realized that these women, many of whom got their licenses years and years ago, that their licenses were starting to run out because they were retiring from the business or they were dying off, And so the question came, should we issue new legal prostitution or should we ban it completely? All right. Now, the foreign media completely misunderstood the context for this discussion and assumed, I saw articles dealing with child prostitution, legalizing child prostitution, which no one in Taiwan was advocating, despite WHO at that time noted that Taiwan had a large number of child prostitutes working illegally. No one was trying to make that legal here. Okay? No one has ever advocating legal prostitution for children. And some of the foreign media, they were discussing things like gigolos or male prostitutes. And that was outside of the scope of the discussion that was going on here, which was a very narrow geography and a very narrow context. Now, in your discussions, if someone makes a statement and they use a word like, well, Patsy uses drugs and drugs are bad. Well, that word drugs, what does it mean? Are they talking about all drugs? She has a Panadol, she has Tylenol. Oh goodness, Patsy's taking aspirin. Or are we talking about banned recreational substances? Or are we talking about legal drugs for recreational purposes? Tobacco and nicotine or alcohol. Are we discussing that? Or are we talking about cocaine, heroin, LSD, marijuana? Is there a hierarchy that's being discussed when someone says Patsy's drug use is a bad thing? Are we talking about prescription drugs and the abuse of those? So we need to define that. Those of you in my critical thinking or social psychology and social influence or communication courses, remember from Dewey's reflective thinking that what's up there at the very beginning? We define our terms so that we understand things. Sometimes in the heat of a moment, in an argument or a discussion or a debate or a communication event, someone uses a word and they don't define their terms. And sometimes they misuse a word. Well, when they do that, or when someone makes a statement, do we glom on a mistake, an obvious mistake, an error, or we take something out of context so that we can show how clever we are? Or do we give them the benefit of the doubt? Do we extend the principle of charity because we understand essentially what they are saying? With the principle of charity, we give them the benefit of the doubt, and we don't ascribe logical fallacies or lies to a person if it's clear that there is a coherent interpretation available of what they've said. And when we respond to the best interpretation of their statements in the spirit that they have made them, rather than nitpick. Okay? Essentially, under the principle of charity, we're seeking truth. Not just cleverness. My words, they are clever, and I can use them as daggers to disassemble your arguments. Or do I give you the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, this is where you're going, and if this argument is true, here would be my response. I want the truth. I want my arguments. I want my case to be made in such a way that it demonstrates a strength of thinking, that my case wins not from manipulation, but because it's actually the better way to go. And that's the principle of charity. Now we can look at the principle of charity and expand that quite a bit. In fact, it's very much also aligned to what's called the principle of rational accommodation, which essentially is we make maximum sense of the words and thoughts of others when we interpret in a way that optimizes agreement or truth. All right, so we maximize their argument so that our argument is really the best argument we can make. We're not just attacking someone who has obviously faulty thinking, although if they do have obviously faulty thinking, we let them know that. But if they have a reasonable argument, okay, and it's reasonable to see that they have a rational argument, we treat that as their argument. And that's where we respond, so that we are best able to bring forth the truth or the best solution to a discussion. Okay? Now, Willard Van Orman-Kine suggested that there are essentially 4 versions of the principle of charity. Now, those are alternate ways we can conflict with one another, so we use the principle that best fits a certain situation. For instance, 1, the other uses words in an ordinary way, and so we respond to their ordinary usage. 2, the other makes true statements. 3, the other makes valid arguments, and that's where the critical thinking and logic come in. And of course, 4, the other says something interesting, and we respond in that way. Now, a related principle to the principle of charity is called the principle of humanity, and that which states that we assume that another speaker's beliefs and desires are connected to each other and to reality in some way. And we attribute to that person the propositional attitudes one supposes one would hear or have oneself in those circumstances. Okay? So we don't see them as alien or other or ridiculous. And we respond to the actual statement or actually the presupposed argument underneath the language. Now, an example of misuse of rhetoric and where the principle of charity is not applied, I can give you an excellent example of where it really should have been applied, was in Barack Obama's re-election campaign for the American presidency. There was a point where Obama made a statement of, you didn't build that. And that one phrase, you didn't build that, was glommed on by the opposition. And folks like Mitt Romney and McCain, and pretty much everyone else on the other side of the aisle, was ridiculing that statement. You didn't build that. Yes, we did. You're just a silly man, Obama, with your silly, narrow ideas that ridicule our contributions to society. But actually, if you listen to the full context of the speech, it was really very clear what Obama meant when he said, you didn't build that. He meant you didn't build that by yourself. The government actually helped because the government, from the people, built the infrastructure that helped you get things done, built other aspects. And so people don't succeed on their own. The government actually helps. And we need the government to build and maintain infrastructure, which in the United States is sorely lacking at the moment. The infrastructure in the U.S. is falling apart, and it's not a secret that it's really falling apart fast. And without funding, bye-bye economic success and power. But that's another point. All right. So some folks glommed on Obama's statement and they took it out of context and they said, this is his weakness. Let's attack there. But realistically, had they applied the principle of charity, they would have met his statements as he intended them and then approached that and had a much stronger logical argument. Of course, it's American politics, and so logical arguments aren't always needed. Let's just appeal to emotions and fear. Yay! I'm getting silly, but that's a very strong case where the principle of charity was obviously not being used. Now, on the other side, it happens too. I read a few liberal newspapers, and I'm often complaining at, sure, you can use that headline and make the guy look like a jerk or an idiot, but that's not what he's actually saying. And let's attack him for what he's actually saying and what he actually means, and not just for this stuff. And so, use the principle of charity rather than manipulating and things like that. Now, principle of charity can also be expanded to another principle, one that's actually a lot more severe, and some folks will use that in terms of what's called the principle of the least convenient possible world. And in that principle, not only do you apply the principle of charity, which has the presupposition that a rational explanation of another person's arguments can be found, and we should, if we find that rational explanation, we should respond to that. We should give them the benefit of the doubt that they are making an actual case and respond to that case. In the least convenient possible world, we don't jump into their shoes and say, okay, if I was making this argument, would I make this? If I was in this context, would I find this to be a rational argument? Rather, in the least convenient possible world, we assume that not only does the other person's ideas make sense, but all arguments made against our case hold true. And if they all hold true, can we still make our case? This is also called the steel man principle. Essentially, you're throwing yourself up against all arguments and assuming that all arguments are true, or at least valid in some way. Can we still make a case for our position? It's a very difficult statement or activity to have, but what it does is it makes certain that your arguments are strong and that you're running minimal risk of rationalizations for your position. That you're not just backing a certain candidate because he's a liberal or a conservative, whatever part of the aisle you're on. You're not just backing someone because of personality or because of presuppositions of liberality or conservatism. That the arguments in and of themselves actually hold. And that's the principle of least convenient possible world, which has some relation to the principle of charity. But that's the principle of charity. I wanted to throw that out there because I was recently asked. I hope that this has given you a little leeway. At the university where I teach, National Zhengzhi University, Guoli Zhengzhi Daxue, in my communication classes, I actually have an activity based on the principle of charity. Actually, it's based on the idea that sometimes in critical theory, we go too far. And this is what I call the activity of stories for listening and discussion. Essentially, I give the students short stories, very short stories, typically flash fiction, 2,000 words or less. And then I give them a series of true-false statements. Okay? And there's a statement, and then they have true, false, don't know, and why. True, the story tells us this. False, the story does not tell us this information. It tells us the opposite, or it tells us something that shows this is false. Don't know, the story does not give us information on this. And why. They have to tell us why it's true, why it's false, why don't know. And then I will seed the statements, and this is group discussion time. I'll seed the statement with statements that get them thinking too far, criticizing too much. Sometimes we can just take things at surface value. We can give the author the benefit of the doubt that this is a reasonable argument, and let me address that argument. Sometimes in critical thinking and logic courses, we get so deep into little bitty details that we stop giving the benefit of the doubt and we tear things apart until essentially what happens is my students realize they don't know anything. They've made assumptions. But here's the thing. Sometimes assumptions are reasonable. And so while you study critical thinking, social influence, social psychology, while you study logic and fallacy principles, remember, in actual application, sometimes you just gotta say, yeah, within reason, that's okay. Now, in high school and university, I was a debater. That was my sport, debate. I've got the body for it. In fact, I was a master debater. In fact, I was so good, and I would hit so strong and so fast, master debating, that sometimes I just skipped the duh in master debater. But as a debater, I focused on language and argumentation. And sometimes we hit folks for faulty statements that weren't there. We over-criticized and we missed principles that were genuinely reasonable. It wasn't our job. Our job was to tear apart arguments. And so sometimes we misapplied the principle of charity. Now, outside of that context, I know that the principle of charity is where we really should have gone. And I encourage you to do so too. Remember our buddy Quintillion and the Quintillion Paradigm. And if you don't know what that means, well, go to the link in the description and take the course. Okay? That's the principle of charity. Just wanted to throw that out there. This is Dr. Brian David Phillips. Live trance and prosper. Bye-bye.